right off the bat talk to you about political corruption and money laundering. You're an attorney. You specialize in anti-money laundering fraud. So tell us just a little bit of your background in that area and just one or two examples of some of the most egregious things that you've seen.
Great. So yeah, I went to law school and I kind of always knew I didn't want to be a traditional lawyer. So I'd taken a course on combating corruption, and my professor, Elizabeth Spahn, she's actually on a list in China. Anytime she's in China, the authorities follow her around.
Wow.
Because she's a fighter against corruption. And when I got out of law school, I got plugged into some people who were in this JD preferred field. So I'm not practicing law, though I do have my bar, and it's called anti-money laundering. So what I do is I review wire transfers, usually international transfers, usually business transfers that spread all across the globe, basically because the US is the reserve currency of the world. Any international wire or most international wires are cleared through a US bank. And that gives us a really unique opportunity to review that activity. What I do is I investigate the parties involved in those transactions. And if I can't substantiate that activity for whatever reason, I will file what is called a suspicious activity report, which goes to the Treasury Department, and they will be the ones who would prosecute that activity.
So how much of that involves very wealthy elites and politicians?
A lot. So I guess my best experiences are with something you might have heard of called the Panama Papers.
Yeah.
That came through my desk when I remember the morning I was sitting at breakfast and I saw the news wire come across this thing called the Panama Papers, and I was like, oh man, when I get to work on Monday, this is going to be the first thing I have to do. And in fact, it was. There was a scandal in Brazil known as Operation Car Wash that made a lot of news because this Brazilian oil and construction companies were working together to bribe politicians essentially all across the globe. And the most recent one that I handled was something called the Russian laundromat, where an Estonian bank was being used to funnel money from the Russian mafia all across Western Europe and in some cases the United States.
Yeah.
And so all three of those investigations not just involve heavy money laundering, but also political elites that were trying to hide money that they had very likely stolen from somebody.
Why am I not surprised? I always think that the biggest part of the Russian scandal isn't this idea that there's been troll farms or they influenced our election per se, but it's really about global oligarchy. Because the oligarchs in Russia learned how to be oligarchs from Americans, right? From Harvard, from Larry Sumner, all these guys that were involved in that. But let's go back and talk about the Panama Papers for a second. For folks that are unaware, this was pretty much shell corporations that were set up by some attorneys down in Panama, and they were helping these folks hide money in shell corp under shell corp under shell corp, and not paying. It was like a tax haven for not paying any taxes, etc. What part of that do you think was most detrimental? I mean, this got some press, but you would have thought that it would have had more press.
Yeah, so the reason it didn't get a lot of press, I would say, is for two big reasons. Number one, the investigative journalist who brought this to light died when her car exploded.
That's right.
So these are the sorts of things that happen to you when you start to investigate these sorts of people. And number two, the people that were involved are essentially your most powerful people on the globe. A lot of people want to know why Jeffrey Epstein, people knew what he was doing for a long time and nobody brought it up. And you have to look no further than his social connections, right? Yeah. So, and I think the same thing applies to this president. People say, you know, Donald Trump is clearly a money launderer. He is in the real estate and casino industries, which are hyper high risk industries when it comes to money laundering. How is this guy walking around free? Well, he makes a lot of really important connections. He's been a donor to a lot of politicians way before he himself was involved in politics. And doing these sorts of things helps you cover your bases and keeps the authorities from sniffing around too much. Because if anybody wants to be sort of a cowboy and go after these high-end money launderers or oligarchs, somebody above them will say, no, don't do that. You're either getting a desk job, or if you're a police officer, you're on traffic patrol now. So
Yeah.
yeah, there are systems in place that keep these things from coming to light.
Yeah, no, 100%. The corruption is very broad and deep. It transcends both parties. And I wish more people would realize that. The plutonymy isn't specific to the Republican Party. A big chunk of them, including Epstein. I mean, look at a lot of his donations. And look, you can go back through Trump's career and see where he gave a lot of money to Democratic politicians. So the plutonymy feathers the plutonymy's nest. That transcends parties. And this is the system that we should be fighting. I don't think that we can really, at this point, have a conversation about right versus left ideals, because the plutonymy's ideals, it's a whole set of principles that occur versus the 99%. And if we don't resolve that first, we can't really have the other conversation, because these things are so intertwined, right? The corruption's so deep.
Yeah, agree. I mean, there are not two parties in America. There's only one party, and it's the business party.
That's right.
And it transcends both parties.
One of your, I thought was really interesting in this area, one of your proposals is called the Anti-Panama Papers Act. And I want you to walk us through this platform, because I think you're in a unique perspective, since this is what you do for a living, to really address the ins and outs of the problem here in a way that most Americans don't see. They don't see this stuff, right? And they hear very little of it being reported by the mainstream media. So walk us through your Anti-Panama Papers Act and why you think this is a necessary component to cleaning up corruption.
Great. I'd love to walk it through. So we're going to start with the problem. What is the problem? Is that you have this very corrupt infrastructure that you were talking about with the Panama Papers. You have these shell corporations that are set up in places like Panama, Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, places with really lax tax laws, where you get to set up what are called nominee companies, where somebody who is a local attorney will basically take a bunch of money to set themselves up as the registered representative of these companies. And there's no way of finding who the real person who brought this money in, who they really are, and how they got that money. Yeah. So what my Anti-Panama Papers Act does is it tries to attack that infrastructure of opaque shell companies. Now, how do we do that? The number one thing that I think would help us a lot is having strong global beneficial ownership rules. So what does that mean? A beneficial owner is the person who is going to directly benefit, the person who earned that money and who is trying to set up this shell corporation. Right. Who is this person? No more nominee ownerships where you get to have a local person in the Cayman Islands who is definitely willing to take a tremendous sum of money so that they could charge you a fee, a 10% fee on that huge sum of money, and set themselves up as the stand-in, the sort of face of this shell company. Mm-hmm. Because just like you said, you'll basically set up a shell company that will set up another shell company that'll set up another shell company. They'll set one up in Panama, which will own another one in the Cayman Islands, which will own another one in Cyprus. And it's basically just a jumping game where you're trying to find out who really owns this. Right. If we had strong beneficial ownership rules, we would be able to go directly to the name of the person who directly owns this shell company, who directly earned that money, and know what they're doing, how they earn that money, and what they intend to use this shell company for. Because in fact, all they're really doing is they're trying to evade taxes. Mm-hmm. That's the ultimate goal of doing all of this. Right. You're setting these companies up in places where people are not going to ask for a lot of paperwork, where people are not going to charge you local taxes on this money. And essentially nobody really knows. I've seen a lot of documentaries where people will wear masks so that they're not exposing who they are, but they'll walk through an office building and they'll open up a room and it's full of boxes and they'll say, yeah, we have 30,000 shell companies registered in this room.
All at the same address, right?
Yeah, all at the same address. And there are places in Arizona, in Delaware, in Florida, specific street addresses that I can tell you every time I'm investigating a company and it comes back to this particular street in Florida, I know that there's some